The last episode of The Mandalorian really upset a lot of people. In fact, on IMDb, it's currently the lowest rated Mandalorian episode of all time, sitting at a 7.3, with what I consider to be by far the worst episode of The Mandalorian, The Gunslinger, being at 7.5. For those of you that don't remember, that was the Tatooine episode from the very first season of Mando. So why exactly is this? And what exactly is my stance on why Star Wars fans are so upset by the last episode of The Mandalorian? Obviously, the biggest reason most people were really pissed off about the last episode of The Mandalorian is because there wasn't really a lot of Mandalorian in it. Now, this is something of a trend that began with the Book of Boba Fett, as in the Book of Boba Fett, Boba is literally absent for the majority of 2 episodes, as instead we switched to Mando, making it feel like essentially a third of that story was a Mandalorian pre-season preview rather than the Book of Boba Fett. And that's interesting for me personally, because those 2 episodes of the Book of Boba Fett were my favorite of the entire first season. In the end, I really have mixed feelings about this episode. While I feel like the look at Coruscant and the New Republic is exceptionally interesting, and I really did enjoy that world building, again, the show is marketed and pitched as The Mandalorian, which is why a ton of fans are upset. So while I understand a lot of the criticism that the episode is getting right now, I do not believe at all that it's the worst episode The Mandalorian has ever produced. If I'm going to continue the discussion about this, I'm going to have to give a spoiler warning right here. So if you haven't seen the last episode, I implore you to go do so. With this 3rd episode, it's really tying back a lot of the themes and a lot of the world building that we got brief glimpses of in the 1st and 2nd season. Specifically, it appears as if Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau are really focusing on the cloning aspect of The Rise of Skywalker and the character of Snoke specifically, as we can hear Snoke's theme in the 2nd season of The Mandalorian when they explore the cloning project, as well as in the most recent episode in the Opera House when Dr. Pershing is discussing the cloning program to the New Republic itself. The point I'm trying to get at is these are themes and a storyline that was established in the very first season, and I do believe that it will be incredibly important moving forward. Whether or not that's setting up a brand new antagonist of this era in Star Wars lore, or if it's going farther to explain Snoke. The Snoke character, sadly, is one of the most underwritten characters in all of the sequel trilogy, and in the end is really just there to push along the story of Kylo Ren, Ben Solo. An exceptionally disappointing conclusion for a character who was built up to be the next big Grand Emperor. Now, is it our fault as fans for thinking that this character was going to be extremely important? I don't believe so at all. Despite what a lot of the filmmakers were trying to tell us, and that the fans were the ones that built up Snoke, the story in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi very much build the character up, despite what many would tell you. He's the greatest dark side threat in the galaxy at this point in time, he's the main antagonist essentially of The Force Awakens, and is very much serving the role as the Emperor figure. So for the writers and directors to come out and say, hey, you guys are dumb for thinking that this guy is so important and the next big bad, while making him simultaneously the leader of the First Order and the master of Kylo Ren, doesn't really make a lot of sense at all. But why am I bringing up this gripe? These gripes that are at this point years old and should be irrelevant. Well, what I think Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau are trying to do is build up the lore and to essentially lead into the sequel trilogy much more organically. A lot of the complaints about the sequels is that there's no real build-up and interconnective tissue between the 3 movies, and I think The Mandalorian is very much committing itself to being a prequel to the sequel trilogy while giving us its own unique story. Like it or not, for the time being, these sequels are very much going to be where the Star Wars universe has led to, and despite what a lot of fans want, and even what various rumors are saying, I believe that the sequels are at this point concrete. So, how exactly does this episode in The Mandalorian, in my opinion, improve upon the sequels, and specifically the character of Snoke? The character of Snoke in The Rise of Skywalker, The Last Jedi, and The Force Awakens is essentially a nothing character. A vague dark side entity, like I said, used to push along the plot than rather anything exceptionally important to the lore or the universe. What The Mandalorian is introducing, though, is the idea that Snoke is an amalgam of various powerful Force sensitives. He's an amalgam of Grogu, an amalgam of potentially Luke Skywalker's hand, and bits of Palpatine himself, a Frankenstein-type monster that Darth Sidious wanted to possess post-mortem, a sort of synthetic chosen one, if you will. And in my opinion, again, this makes Snoke a far more interesting character, and makes much more sense why Darth Sidious wouldn't be able to inhabit a body like this than what we got, which is basically just a line of throwaway dialogue in the Rise of Skywalker novelization that says that the bond between Palpatine's spirit and the body of Snoke didn't actually work out. In the end though, I do think that this goes a long way to improve upon the character of Snoke and make him much more frightening. In my original breakdown on this moment, I stated that in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein took pieces of the most beautiful corpses that he could find, and then sewed them together to attempt to create what he believed was a beautiful creature. In the end though, the pieces didn't match up at all, and what resulted was a monster. And I think that taking inspiration from this story and converting it into Star Wars lore is a really good idea, especially for a character who is essentially a blank slate. This also goes a really long way to explain exactly why Snoke is so powerful. But what it also does is it introduced to us in Star Wars lore the idea of cloning Force sensitives. Now, there have been various rumors of exactly who one of the main antagonists would be in the Ahsoka Tano series. Initially, a lot of fans believed that Thrawn would be the only antagonist, but since we've gotten reports that there will be a Dark Jedi threat in the Ahsoka show, and a threat that originates from Star Wars Legends lore. I'm of course talking about the clone of the original Jedi Master, Jorah Sabaoth, who, in Legends continuity, is the Force-wielding antagonist in much of the stories that follow the events of Return of the Jedi. And again, Jorah Sabaoth is a clone. While this episode may have been very disappointing for a lot of fans because we want to see the Mandalorian in a show called The Mandalorian, and that's a sentiment that I completely agree with. In my eyes, this episode is not a throwaway at all, and is simply building up to a big grand climax that Dave Filoni recently spoke about in an interview. In an interview, Dave Filoni said that he believed that perhaps the finale of the Mandalorian saga could actually take place on the big screen, with all of these interconnected stories coming together in one grand climactic event. Now, this is something that we all assumed would actually occur with these stories, but now to hear from the horse mouths itself that this is going to happen is really exciting. And I think that in order to tie everything back together, you can't just drop plot threads that will be extremely important to the sequels. As again, part of what makes Star Wars so cool is the interconnectedness of all of the stories. And in my opinion, it's not necessarily fan service to have a character like Luke Skywalker go after another Force sensitive in The Mandalorian. It's all interconnected, and it all flows and leads to one another. The point in time where we follow the Mandalorian would absolutely lead into the events of The Force Awakens all the ways to the rise of Skywalker, and I think to have it not interconnected would be a cheap move, despite what people think of the sequels. But again, my friends and acolytes, this is just my opinion and my opinion on a lot of the outrage about this most recent episode of The Mandalorian. If you dislike it, I absolutely understand why. I do think it's one of the weaker episodes, but by no means do I think it's bad or a betrayal on the Mandalorian universe. So, where do you stand on this? I want this video to be a dialogue where people can share their thoughts and try to figure out what sort of balance we can have where the universe feels interconnected and like one timeline, but at the same time, strictly about the story and characters involved. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching. I don't often do these opinion piece videos, so I hope you enjoyed this change of pace. May the Force be with you, and I hope to hear from you soon.